and welcome back to Reading Rule, y'all. This is our third author talk. Yes! And today I have the absolute privilege to talk with Jeff Zentner, author of the recently released In the Wild Light, as well as The Serpent King, Goodbye Days, and Rain and Delilah's Midnight Matinee. The first book talks actually featured on this channel are of The Serpent King, so check those out if you want to know more about that particular text. Jeff Zentner is the author of New York Times notable book The Serpent King, Goodbye Days, and Rain and Delilah's Midnight Matinee. He's won the William C. Morris Award, the Amelia Elizabeth Walden Award, the International Literacy Association Award, and the Westchester Fiction Award. He's a two-time Southern Book Prize finalist. He's been longlisted for the Carnegie Medal and UKLA, and was a finalist for the Indies Choice Award. He was selected as Publishers Weekly Flying Start and an Indies Introduced Pick. His books have been translated into 15 languages, and he speaks fluent Portuguese, which I didn't know, having lived in the Amazon region of Brazil for 2 years, and he currently lives in Nashville, Tennessee. He came to writing through music, starting his creative life as a guitarist and eventually becoming a songwriter. And he's released 5 albums and appeared on recordings with a number of illustrious musicians like Iggy Pop, Nick Cave, and Debbie Harry. So we welcome Jeff today. He has a short amount of time, and we're excited to talk with him. So let's dig into the questions. Okay, so since we're all about place here at Reading Rule, y'all, I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on your own place-connected background a little bit. Tell us where you're from, how you think that shapes who you are as a person and a writer. And because rural or small towns play a major role in the Wild Light and The Serpent King, I'm really curious about your connections to the rural as well.
Yeah, so I've lived most of my life in Nashville, Tennessee. All of my life I've lived in kind of rural adjacent areas, but Nashville is, I think, in many ways kind of the capital of rural America in a sense. I mean, it's the place where certainly the music of rural America has found greater distribution to the world. And so kind of between Nashville, Tennessee, and Asheville, North Carolina is a place that I also lived in, a place that was also heavily influential on me, on my worldview, the kind of things I love. I just love the rural South. I think it's a beautiful place. I love Southerners. I love rural Southerners. I love all rural people. I mean, I come from rural people. And so there's a great affection there. For me, there's a great affection for rural places, rundown places, forgotten places. To me, those places always have always felt very near and dear to my heart. And I could explain to you some of the reasons why, but there are also deeper connections that I could never explain in words why it is, why I'll drive through a small town and just feel a very instant connection to it. But when it came time to write my own stories, I knew that those were the stories I wanted to tell, were the stories of those rural people, because those were the stories that I told when I was a musician. I spent years as a songwriter before switching over to writing books, and those were kind of fundamentally the stories that I was telling, because that's the genre of music I worked in. I worked in country and blues, and those are rural music forms.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I really like that you mentioned that there's sort of an inability to explain a connection to a place sometimes, because I'm from rural Indiana, but all of my dad's family is from rural East Tennessee. And so anytime, once we crossed like that Kentucky line and we started getting into the mountains a little bit in Tennessee, like when we were going down to Salina for like family reunions and stuff, I always felt home, but I've never lived there a day in my life.
Well, here's the thing about that. I firmly believe in genetic memory. I really do. I believe that we are encoded with a certain affinity for a certain place. And the example I will give is I have always been a huge Anglophile. Like, I love Britain, I love Scotland, I love Ireland. Those places, I've always felt such a deep draw and connection to them. The music, the people, the culture, the writing, all of that. And I could never explain why. And finally, in the last couple of years, I do one of those like ancestry DNA result things. And I come to discover I'm like 70% British, Irish, and Scottish, which I had no idea. I thought I was 0% any of those things. I thought I was like Italian and German and anything but British, Scottish, and Irish. So like I really do believe that there is some sort of encoding in my genetics that leads me to form an affinity with those places. And I think too, it's the same thing that made the Scots and the Irish, when they came over to America, form an affinity with the places that looked like home, which were the mountains of North Carolina, the mountains of East Tennessee that look like the Scottish Highlands, that look like Ireland with how lush and green they are.
Yes, and I'm totally on board with that, especially because when my grandfather moved from East Tennessee up to Indiana, because as my uncle Lemuel Leroy says, we was starving down there. He talked about how like trees grew in clumps in Indiana because of the way the land is cleared, because in the holler it's not like that at all.
Right.
But then when he finally like settled somewhere in his adult life in Indiana, they settled in Hagerstown, um, on a huge hill, you know, like the hilliest place you can get, still staying kind of close to family that was in Tipton, Indiana. But anyway, and I do the same thing. Like when I moved to Texas, the first thing that I looked for were cornfields, and where I lived initially, there were only ranches because the soil wouldn't support it. And so when we were looking to move a little farther north, we found a house that was near some cornfields, even though it's in this huge subdivision and it feels kind of like claustrophobic. Like those cornfields, like driving by those cornfields just makes me feel like, okay, like, like I'm somewhere I can recognize, I'm somewhere where I can be.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, well, thank you so much for that discussion around place. It's sort of my obsession, and sometimes I don't feel like people like want to talk about it as much as I do, but I'm really glad that we were able to talk about it. So you mentioned a little bit earlier in that response about how your creative writing journey started with songwriting, and you have recorded on a number of illustrious artists work, and also I think released some of your own stuff, right? Some of your own albums. I need to check those out. I haven't done that yet.
That's mostly what I've done, is mostly my own stuff, but I did a little bit of side work with some other
Studio work.
artists who were much more well known than me.
Well, I'm gonna have to find your stuff. And I'm excited to listen to it. But I know that you became interested in writing for young adults after volunteering with Tennessee Teen Rock Camp and Southern Girls Rock Camp. And as a kid, your parents would drop you off at a library and you'd read until they closed. And so you have a really good relationship with reading and writing and literacy. But I'm curious if we could dig a little bit deeper into why you write and why you became a writer.
Yeah, so I initially was drawn to music because I wanted to make art in some form. I felt this as a teenager. I felt a hunger to create art. I'm not the kind of person who likes to stand by and watch things and kind of be a passive observer. I'm very active. I want to be involved in the things I love. So I loved books and music as a teenager, but again, growing up in a rural area, I never exposed to authors, and I grew up pre-internet, which makes a huge difference. I mean, in a lot of ways, I grew up more like a teenager in the 1950s than a teenager today. You had your phone that was attached to your wall. You had your TV. I guess we had VCRs, right? So that was one thing I had on the teenagers of the 50s. But even still, we spent a lot of time just cruising around in our cars looking for something to do. So that's more like the 1950s. So I was never exposed to authors. And when you love books as a kid, I think you tend to put authors on a pedestal, and you don't assume authors are people like you. You assume authors are these, mystical wizards who live in the top of ivory towers, and are just very different from you. So that was my assumption, that writing books wasn't something that people like me did. But I knew that people like me made music because I saw music around me. So I got a guitar and I taught myself how to play, and got pretty decent at guitar. And then in my 20s, I formed a band and we toured around some. And we were called Creech Holler, and we did Appalachian murder ballads and old timey songs and Mississippi Hill country blues and all kind of electrified and spooky Southern Gothicified. People ask me what genre the music was, and I always call it kind of Southern Gothic rock is what we were.
Sounds
So
awesome.
we did that all through my 20s, and then I hit my 30s, and things kind of started to slow down, and I came to this realization that people don't tend to make it big in music after age 30. They just really don't. I mean, if you hear somebody breaking out on the radio, getting huge, I mean, they're going to be in their 20s for the most part. And I was past that age of expiration. So it was settling in the realization that I was just not going to be a huge musician. I was not going to make a living as a musician. So I start volunteering at Tennessee Teen Rock Camp and Southern Girls Rock Camp, and really just fall in love with young adults. And I want to make art for young adults. They seem like a great audience to make art for. They're so passionate about the art that they love. That's who I want to create art for. But of course, long past the due date to make music for young adults. So I think, what else can I do? And I realized that there's this whole big category of books now called young adult books. And I have a dual realization that you don't have to be a young kid to break into publishing. I mean, you can be in your 50s, 60s, 70s releasing your first book. So I had not missed my window to slip in and start publishing books. So that's what I decided to do. So my switch to becoming a writer was very much audience driven. It That desire to write for young adults was the thing that finally got me over my fear to start writing, as somebody who really had never known any authors, never met an author, didn't have an MFA, didn't have any training in creative writing, none of that stuff. My education in writing has been solely from reading good books. That's it. And now writing them.
Yeah. Um, I think I've talked about that before, how like growing up in a rural town, like I assumed that all published authors lived in New York City, Chicago, and LA because
Totally.
that seemed like where the publishing houses were. And any movie I saw about publishing, that's where people lived in like a tiny walk up and like, they
Yep.
waitressed until they made their big break or, whatever. And so like I just assumed that like people like me didn't write books. But when you watch things like Austin City Limits and you listen to the Grand Ole Opry, you realize that country people write music, and
Exactly.
they can
Yep.
tell stories through their music. And so that connection totally makes absolute sense to me. Um, so I love the FAQ section of your website, to kind of change gears. Um, and there you mentioned that you do a lot of writing on your phone, like on the bus to work or, whatever, which totally reminded me a little of John Prine writing songs like in his mail truck. Um, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your writing process and routine. As a teacher, I always try to inspire my students to kind of figure out what worked for them and develop their own thing. But I think that seeing and hearing how other people work in process is helpful. And so I'm just curious, like if you keep a notebook or do you do voice memos on your phone? Like what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so my first four books I wrote almost completely on the bus to and from work with my right thumb on my phone, because that was the time I had available. Now I work remotely. I do still have a day job. Haven't quit the day job. Not planning on quitting the day job unless something big happens. But I don't have a bus commute anymore because I now work remotely. So I have to find other times to write, and it's a little more difficult. Having a bus commute was a real fixed finite amount of writing time to get every day. You got to get your writing done during that time. Um so I've been struggling a little bit to find writing time, but I get it in here and there. A lot of my writing process is just thinking, a lot of thinking, just thinking about the characters, listening to those characters' voices, to where when it comes time to put pen to paper, so to speak, it flows out a lot more easily. I'm not working out stuff on the page so much. I kind of work it out in my head before and then go to the page. So what that means is, as far as writers go, I don't spend that much time at the laptop, relatively speaking. But I am thinking about my book while I'm mowing the lawn. I'm thinking about my book while I'm kayaking. I'm thinking about my book while I'm putting away dishes or folding laundry or any of those things. That's the beauty of writing, is that you're on the clock as a creator when you're thinking about your story and when you're consuming stories. So when I'm watching Netflix to unwind, I'm on the clock, I'm writing, because you're taking in story input, you're learning, you're looking at what works and what doesn't. That's all time on the clock as a creator. And you kind of can't do that as a musician. Even in Nashville, you can't take a guitar on the bus and work out a song on the bus. You can't, as a sculptor, take your sculpture on the bus and work on your sculpture. You can't work on your sculpture while you put away laundry. And of course, I don't know jack about sculpting. Like, maybe you can work on I don't know. Some sculptor will correct me, but you can do a lot of work on books in your head, um, without being in a position to actually write. And then when you do write, your writing's very productive.
I feel like you do a lot of work to embody your story too. Like when I think about all of your Instagram posts where you're on rivers, and I think about In the Wild Light and Cash and his affinity for rivers, or even like your recent trip um, to do research for the book that you're working on now. I feel like you do a lot of work to really embody the experiences of like the place and the natural world and like the world around your characters and the way that they feel in that world. And I feel like that really comes across in your books, and I think that's one of the things that makes them so good and makes them feel so authentic, is that you have experienced those experiences in your own body. And so then like processing that and putting that on the page, I feel like has to be easier than just trying to think about what it might feel like to experience those things, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and that's why all my stories have been set in rural Tennessee, rural South. Not, well, not necessarily rural. Goodbye Days is set in Nashville, but that's even closer to my own experience. The things I love find their way into my stories. Every one of my books is just as many of the things that I love at that time as I can logically and plausibly cram into a book will find their way into the book. So, every one of my books, if you want to see what I loved in the 2 years leading up to 2017 when Goodbye Days was released, read Goodbye Days, and you'll see where I like to go walk in Nashville. You'll see the places I like to go. You'll see the things that I thought about and that preoccupied me. It's the same with all my books. So it's just really the only way I know how to write. That's the only way I know how to make a rich story, is just to fill it with the things I love, the things that I know, the things that are dear to me and close to my heart.
So sort of connected to that, you've talked a lot about how your reading process impacts and has influenced the way that you write too. And you talked about like watching Netflix and how like when you take in story, you can use that as you're like thinking about informing and writing story. So what do you like to read, and how do you think that influences your writing?
Yeah, so almost all of my young adult reading now is for blurbs. I like to blurb books for people. To me, first of all, I get sent really high quality books to blurb. I'm lucky that way. I get really really high quality books sent to me to blurb. So I've got this pipeline of high quality YA constantly coming at me, and that's almost exclusively my YA reading is blurbing books. As far as my other reading, I like to branch out a little bit because why it's good to read widely. If you're a YA reader, you should not be only reading YA. I think that's a real mistake that a lot of YA writers make. Um, so I like to read. Richard Powers is a favorite of mine. He lives here in Tennessee. He just had a book called Bewilderment come out. His book The Overstory came out a couple years ago, and that one's awesome. I love Mohsin Hamid. I love Jesmine Ward, Ocean Vong, Michael Ondaatje. I love reading stuff with beautiful, beautiful language and lush sentences and gorgeous, precise imagery. And I read now a ton of poetry, because poetry really attunes you to the possibility of language,
Mhm.
right? There is story in poetry, but it's not so much a story that I read poetry for. It's to consider the possibility of language, to consider the possibility of imagery, to consider the threads of connection between concepts and ideas and images and all of those things that we take in as human beings. So I read a ton of poetry. It works really nicely with my schedule too, because I can take down a whole poetry book in like an hour or two. And I don't have a ton of reading time, so reading poetry is a really, really efficient way for me to get a lot of nutrients. It's a very nutrient rich area of reading for me.
So speaking of that and thinking about that, let's talk about recent and future projects. What can you talk to us about? What do you have in the works? What are you particularly proud of? I know that you just had an amazing New York Times review of In the Wild, come out, which was fantastic. So yeah, talk to us about what you've got in the works and what you're proud of.
Yeah, well, proud of that review. Obviously, it was by Daniel Woodrell, who wrote Winter's Bone, which is kind of one of the premier texts of rural America of the last, 50 years. Amazing book. So that felt really good. I am currently working on a verse novel with a YA author friend. We haven't sold it yet, so there's not too much I can say about it yet, but I'll say that it's a verse novel that also incorporates dialogue. So it's a novel in verse and conversation, is what we call it. And I'm really excited about that. That's been a really cool process working with her on that. I'm currently working on a book for the adult market. I don't want to say too much about that one yet. But I will say that if you like my YA books and you like the emotional fields that I work in my young adult books, then imagine me taking that sensibility and moving it over to the adult realm. And that's really kind of what you're going to get out of my adult books. It's following some of the threads that I set up in the young adult books and see what happens when these characters get to be 38, which is the age of my characters in this book. So I'm working on that right now. I'm really pleased with how that's going. And yeah, so that's kind of what I got in the works. This is one of the first times in my writing life I've ever had two projects going simultaneously, which is exciting.
Yeah, how's it going?
It's going. I think it's going well.
I just know that when I have multiple irons in the fire, sometimes it just feels like, did I bite off more than I can chew, or can I actually do this?
Well, nobody's waiting on either of them. We're not under
True.
contract for either of them, so that takes off some of the pressure.
Well, that's good. How are we doing on time? Are we okay?
Yep, we're doing good.
Okay. So I really only have one question left for you, and that is thinking about teachers and students who both may be aspiring writers. What advice do you have for young people or teachers who want to pursue writing as a career?
So first things first, I would say to be patient, and along with that, allow yourself the time to put your best work into the world. And I say that because publishing is just a glacial process. I mean, it is so not immediate gratification. If I were to sell a new book right now on the spot, if I were to take a call from my editor saying, "Hey, this finished manuscript you just turned in, I'm going to buy it. Where it's going to be a book," it would be 2 years from the date of that phone call to the time it hit the shelves. Okay, so you take that and add to it the time it takes to write a book, which who knows what that is. For some authors it's 3 months, for some authors it's 10 years. The time it takes to edit a book takes months, takes years. My point is, there is nothing to be gained by trying to get published before you're age 22 or something wild like that. Nobody cares about that kind of thing. That kind of thing does not bring you any cachet. So give yourself the time to put your best work into the world. Give your work time to develop. Do not be in a rush. There's no point in being in a rush. The other thing I would say is make your peace with criticism. By that, I mean, some people who never get published are the kind of people who don't let in any criticism. It all bounces off them. They think they're perfect. They think they have nowhere to improve. They think that to make changes to their story based on any outside input is to sacrifice the soul of your story, or to sacrifice your integrity, or something absurd like that. Nonsense. Everybody gets edited. Okay, no author is so good that they don't have any outside input. So those kind of people don't get published. The other kind of people who don't get published are the kind of people who take criticism too hard, and it kind of breaks them, it shatters them, they can't go on. The kind of people who do get published are the kind of people who let in enough criticism to make them grow and blossom, but also don't allow that criticism to overwhelm them and to overtake them and to crush them and break them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Part of it too is like doing research and like finding, a writing community. And I feel like that's another thing that you seem to have in terms of like your Instagram, posts, like friendships with writers who write stuff that's different than you.
Sure.
And, having critical readers who can take a look at your stuff outside of sort of like your editor or your agent or like whoever is the early readers of your stuff, like having trusted friends who can look at it too and be like, okay, like this was awesome, but I have no idea what you're trying to do with this here. Like, can you help me out? Like, where's this going? What am I supposed to think about this? And so I think that's another thing too that I see like through your being as an author. Like, to be as an author, you have to have, I think, a good community. And well, I just want to say thank you so much for making time for this, for agreeing to do this. I'm hoping that this work shows rural students, like we were talking about in the beginning of this interview, that like they can be authors too, that if they write, they are writers, and that it's not just people who live in LA and New York City and Chicago who become writers, but that if you write wherever you are, you're a writer, and that place matters for the work that we do. And I really feel that in your books, and I've loved every single one of them, and I can't wait to read more. So I'm excited about your new projects. And yeah, just thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.